Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 1 of the Adventures in Angular podcast. This week on our panel we have Joe Eames.
Hey everybody.
Aaron Frost.
Hello.
Brian Ford.
Hello.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and we have Miško Hevery here to help us kick off the show.
Thanks for having me.
Miško,
yeah, that's right.
we love you.
So the title of this show is The Birth of Angular, and we're going to just talk about where Angular came from. Before we do that, though, I just want to briefly talk about the show itself. We're going to be doing a few things a little bit differently on the show. One of the first things that's different is that it's going to be a little bit shorter. The other shows we usually aim for about an hour. This one's going to be about a half hour. We might go a little longer here or there. And it's really focused on a framework, which is kind of a first for me at least, because all my other shows focus on language or ecosystem being iOS as opposed to an actual framework. So it should be fun, and we can hopefully get a little bit more into the weeds to talk about, what you need to know to really succeed with Angular.
That's cool, man. I'm excited.
Have you ever wondered if you could be offering a faster, less buggy experience for your customers? I mean, let's face it, the only way you're going to know that is by actually running it on production. So go figure it out, right? You run it on production, but you need something plugged in so that you can find out where those issues are, where it's slowing down, where it's having bugs. You need something like that there. And Raygun is awesome at this. They just added the performance monitoring, which is really slick, and it works like a breeze. I love it. I love it. It's like you get the ray gun and you zap the bugs. Anyway, definitely go check it out. It's going to save you a ton of time, a ton of money, a ton of sanity. I mean, let's face it. Grepping through logs is no fun. And having people not able to tell you that it's too slow because they got sidetracked into Twitter is also not fun. So go check out Raygun. They are definitely going to help you out. There are thousands of customer-centric, customer-focused software companies who use Raygun every day to deliver great experiences for their customers. And if you go to Raygun and you use our link, you can get a 14-day free trial. So you can go check that out at adventuresinangular.com/Raygun.
So where did Angular come from?
From one's imagination, I guess. It actually has been a pretty long road. The original idea was actually that I was a bit frustrated just how much time and effort it takes to build just a simple form that can persist data. And I don't mean like a full-on app. I just mean like, how long does it take to put on a simple form on a site that can collect your email address and your name and then maybe email this to you or store it in the database or something. Just imagine you're kind of a mom and pop shop and you just want to have a guest book or something where people can sign or something like that. And the moment you want to do something, you have to understand things like authentication and databases and all kinds of crazy stuff. And so the original thought for AngularJS was really something very simple, which was, can we, just by adding forms and a bunch of input elements on a page, and maybe a bit of a JavaScript, could we turn that into a self-persisted, URL bookmarkable kind of a database? So that when you come to a site and you visit and you fill out a form and maybe hit a send button, it gives you a URL and you can actually come back to that URL and edit it in the future. So the original goal was not to build a framework, as you can see. The original goal was to allow people who may be not programming savvy to be able to put a page, a little more interactivity into their static page than one would normally have to do.
So more of a toolkit.
Kind of, yeah. The target audience was actually for web designers, somebody who doesn't actually know how to program, but it can just throw a bunch of tags on a page and, turn a form that anybody should be able to do into something that's actually persistible.
Is that kind of the root of the way that Angular extends HTML?
It is.
When you were thinking this, were you working on your own projects at home, or what were you working on when you decided you needed to make the beginnings of it?
Yes, so I had a full-time job at Google. That was writing. We had this group called Test Mercenaries, where we went to different people around Google, different teams, and helped them with testing hygiene, and the goal was kind of a teach a man to fish kind of a thing. How can we teach these projects, how best to structure their code for testability and how best to write unit tests and so on. So that was kind of my day job. And kind of in spare free time, I was kind of toying the framework. Now, this is not the framework, rather, but this idea of Angular and the persistence. And the kind of the impetus, which I forgot to mention, was my boss who said, Miško, I think this JavaScript thing might be useful to know, and you're a Java guy. Maybe you should build something in JavaScript to kind of learn how to use it. And so this idea of a persistible form was kind of what was born out of the discussion.
Okay.
What do you mean by a persistible form?
Again, you just imagine writing an static HTML page, make forms and input fields on it, and throwing a special script tag to the top, and all of a sudden that form, when you hit submit button, actually persists somewhere into some cloud storage, which you don't have to provision. It's automatically provisioned for you. So you really have to know nothing about programming. You just have to know that you make a form, and you throw this tag over there, all of a sudden that form is persistent.
That's cool. And that was kind of the idea behind your initial go at the Angular framework?
Again, it's not a framework at that point. It's really just meant for web designers rather than web developers. So how did it become a framework, I guess, is the question that everybody's wondering, right?
Yes.
So time goes on, and I kind of work on this thing in my spare time, and we actually have, as you can imagine, we have to have a database running in the cloud, and we have to solve a lot of interesting problems about how to do cross-site, cross-URL communication and persistent data and storage and so on and so forth. And so we actually built all this stuff up. And I say we, there was another fellow working with me, Adam Abrams, and the two of us were kind of building this in our free time. And then fast forward a little bit, and my Google day job, I started working on a project called Google Feedback, which the idea was that you come to a Google website and if something doesn't work quite right, you can click a button in a corner and then highlight a portion of the screen and say, this thing over here doesn't look right to me. I would kind of like to report a bug report to it. And these things go back to Google, and then Google tries to automatically correlate similar bug reports together into kind of a cohesive thing. And then based on which things people report more often, you can then prioritize the kind of bug fixes you do.
Working on a back end.
Right. So then imagine you have a forum, and let's say this forum is even hosted on filecolon // You throw a script tag and then the form becomes persistible. The data has to go somewhere. So in addition to having a script tag that you can include to your site, we were also running a database in a cloud, which actually allowed you to store, provision, and then manage all this data out of all these forms. And on this particular backend, I was working with a fellow called Adam Abrams, and he actually built the backend while I was kind of more focused on the front-end JavaScript.
Gotcha.
Now, fast forward a little bit, and we come to Google, where I started working on a new project called Google Feedback. And in Google Feedback, it allows users to kind of highlight portions of the page and send them back to Google, and Google then can correlate similar reports and do something useful like create bug fixes. Now, as you can imagine, if you release this on Google scale, there's a lot of data coming from all the users. And so we need to have a back-end UI which would allow to triage all these comments coming from all the users. And this UI was actually being built in Gwt.
In what?
If you think of, yes, in Gwt, Google Web Toolkit.
GWT. For some reason.
GWT.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, a lot of what this application would do would show different forms and different data that was submitted by the user. And so I was kind of scratching my head and saying, this is really just like a simple static form that can persist data and so on. And so I started really wondering, like, hey, could I really build something on a large-scale app with this idea of just having tags on your HTML that can persist forms? Because if you think about it, any web application is really just a glorified bunch of forms.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so this is the point where part of the frustration with Gwt got to me, where, Gwt is the compiled language. There's, I don't want to get into all the details of it, but it's not easy, and it took us a lot of effort to bring up a Gwt application. I believe it took something like 3 engineers, 6 months before we got kind of a basic UI going in GWT. And the other frustrating part about GWT was that the code was really not written with testing in mind. The GWT framework really was not doing things to make it easy enough to write unit tests. And because of my prior life as a testing advocate, this was a big thing that I really cared about, to make sure that the app I built in GWT would be testable. And so in kind of a moment of frustration, I went to my boss, Brad, and I said, you know what, this is crazy. Why would you ever want to build stuff this way? I believe using this thing I've been playing with on the side, I can redo this whole app in just a couple of weeks. And Brad kind of called me on it, called my bluff, and he's like, okay, well, if you think you can do it, go for it. And so it took, I think I failed on the 2 weeks part. I think it took me more like 3 weeks to rebuild it. But I took random pieces of the Angular library that allows just throwing tags on a page, and I kind of reassembled, reshuffled them until we were able to build a web app using this thing that was originally meant for web designers and was kind of repurposed for actual web developers that actually understood coding. So this was really the birth of AngularJS.
Can I ask you a few questions about what it looked like back then?
Yeah?
So was it a lot heavier, like jQuery, and less frameworky, or what did the code syntax look like?
It's a good question. The idea of tags, for example, ng-show, ng-hide, those were always there, but they were hard-coded into the system. You couldn't just say, oh, let me make a new directive. We gave you a set, and that's the set you had, and you couldn't add or remove things from it. Dependency injection wasn't really part of it. In order to have proper testing, we used injection internally, but we did not have a dependency injection framework that would automatically assemble your application, because there was really no need for it, because it was meant for web designers, right? They would never have to write
True.
anything.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of differences. Okay, so one of the things that happened was that when we started rebuilding the application using this bits and pieces of Angular, we saw things that would be kind of nice. We said, these things like ngIf and ngHide are super useful, but they're fixed. I cannot extend them. I really wished I had something like a zippy or a tab or something like that. And this is where the idea came of turning them into proper directives that could actually be extended. And one of the first things we did was we said, okay, could we take this special set of core directives that are hard-coded into the system, and could we extract them into reusable components so that even Angular itself was built using the same mechanisms that somebody else would be extending them, right? We didn't want to have this two-class world where Angular gets to have special directives, and special powers, and then the users just get some kind of a second-class directive system. We wanted really to prove to ourselves that Angular itself could be built, the core directive could be built by the same API that anybody else could build.
Gotcha. How long into it before you started adding controllers for code reuse and for modularity? How long did you get into it before you started adding those?
So it's funny you bring up controllers, because controllers went through a lot of different life cycles. At the very beginning, we would do this trick where the controller was the scope. We would monkey patch the methods from the controller onto the scope, and all the rules of scope inheritance would apply, and you would have this weird, strange world where you would automatically inherit any parent controllers. And it was a kind of a mess. So the controllers thing is something we've been struggling and revamping many times over. So then later on, the controls became something that you inject scope into. And now the latest reincarnation of, controller as syntax is our way of trying to tame this particular beast.
What were some of the other differences between this early version of Angular that you used to build the feedback app for Google and the version that we use today?
As I said, there was a lot less dependency injection in there. The code was a lot less structured. For example, the whole bootstrapping wasn't even there. You could think of it at the very beginning, the only thing we really had was the HTML compiler, which could match up these tags, the directives against it. And, once you put it together and other teams want to start using you, then you start asking your questions well, how can I make it easier? How can I abstract things away? And it was a constant and continuous kind of a refactoring process of turning this bunch of random code into a reusable framework that we could offer to the world.
Now, was that framework that you offered the world sort of beta tested at Google then?
You could say that. Keep in mind that you really go through the genealogy of the source code. The code started in a Mercurial repository somewhere, and then eventually we moved it into Git and onto a GitHub. And this is all basically things that me and Adam were kind of working on in our free time. Eventually, the code gets open sourced, and only when it gets open sourced do we actually bring the code into Google, where it gets few more times into kind of a real reusable framework, and not to no small part to Igor, who has pushed us a lot, into kind of make it a real project, into a real reusable component. So the history of the code is very long and very convoluted. I wish you could say like, oh, the framework was born on this day, but really it was not something that we set out to do. And you cannot really say that all the code got written in this particular location or even this particular repo. Like, if you really look at the history of it, like, it is a long history. That a lot of it was repurposed and rebuilt, rethought.
So when did it initially release publicly?
Again, what does publicly mean? You mean like version 1.0 or when we open sourced it, or?
Yeah, when did you open source it?
So that was right before we brought the code into Google, and that must have been, that was before my son was born. So that must have been 5 years ago.
Huh.
Awesome.
What led up to that decision? I mean, it's something that we all appreciate now, but...
It was just a convenient way of getting code that was written outside of Google into Google. How do you give somebody rights? This is the code you've been working on, and now you want to bring it to as part of Google. So you say, well, I'm just going to open source it, give it an MIT license, and now anybody, including Google, is free to use it. So that was just the simplest path of least resistance.
Were there any political barriers to that, or were people pretty open to the idea?
It's a very good question. And people always think that Google is like the single unity of something. Whereas, if you think about it, Google is made out of a lot of people and a lot of managers and so on. And it really depends on what kind of people you happen to be surrounded with. And I have to say that my manager, Brad, and his manager, they were very supportive and open, and, they were really interested in the gist of it rather than, what is created where. Like, they were really interested in, okay, what is the goal we're trying to build? What we're trying to make better? How can we get there in the right way, rather than worried about, like, what isn't politically acceptable. So, at the end of the day, everybody did the right thing, and it's really, if you're interested in doing the right thing, you can always find a way that gets you there.
Do you want to move off the individual contributor track and onto the management track? Maybe you want to become a director of engineering or CTO. Let me help. I'm starting a program to help developers move up in their careers using proven techniques and by starting a podcast in order to advance. Right now, I'm only scheduling calls to see where you're at and where you want to go and how you can get there. I'm not doing any sales pitches, just talking to you about where you're at. You can schedule that call at devchat.tv/nextlevel.
Did it ever have a different name besides Angular? Did it ever have, like, Miško's framework? Like, I'm sure that's what it was called first. What was, like, the name, though, that you called it before Angular?
Oh, okay. So Angular was coined by Adam Abrams at the kind of very beginning, before we actually brought it in at Google. So it's kind of been known as Angular ever since. But it did have a name before that, and that was Vanilla Binder.
Vanilla Binder.
Yeah.
Wow. I don't. You
interesting.
should have kept with that one. That one's super catchy.
Yeah.
Then it would have been MB-if.
Yeah. That's funny, man. That's cool. Well, now we know what to have it.
Is it vanilla with a V or manila with an M?
That's a good question, too, and there was some confusion about that, too. I actually thought that the manila binders, the ones that you put inside of, your cabinet, was actually written with a V. So I put it with a V, not realizing that it's actually Manila with an M.
Oh. So you called it Vanilla Binder, BB.
Right.
That wouldn't have been
That's
confusing.
VB.
Well, I think we know we got some good ideas for NGConf then next year with vanilla binders.
That's right. Edible office supplies.
Yeah.
I'm
That's
glad
funny.
you're getting a kick out of it.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, that's like the nuances of the language that most people don't get to know, right? So it's kind of a cool little factoid. So that's cool.
Was there ever a time when you thought that this was really just not going to go anywhere at all?
Yeah, I mean, you always think that when you're at the very beginning. I certainly didn't imagine this kind of success, but I was kind of hoping. So at the very beginning, right, before we kind of brought it into Google, we got super excited when we got one person trying it out and building random things on it. And we kind of showed it to a lot of different people, and it was kind of interesting because most people's reaction was like, what? You're bringing code back to HTML? Didn't you get a note that that's a bad idea? You try to explain it's not quite the same thing. It's actually a good idea, and there's a lot of pushback that happened. So a lot of the feedback kind of that I was getting at the very beginning was like, why would you ever want to put code in HTML? The other thing that I was really struggling with is just how to explain to people what the self-binding, persistent thingamajibob was. And I think the closest I came at the very beginning was just saying, hey, it's like a spreadsheet for the web. And in a spreadsheet, the UI is fixed. You don't get to choose the way the page looks like. But with this thing, you kind of get all the spreadsheets and all the recalculation, all the other benefit that you get with spreadsheet, but you actually get to control the UI through writing your own HTML. So it's kind of like I was trying to explain to people what exactly I was trying to do.
That explanation you just gave, you eventually morphed that into this other vision that actually I heard you present when I first was learning about Angular, which is it's not a framework, it's a better web. And you explained that the browser's a viewport for XML, not designed with web apps in mind. When did you formulate that idea? Because that kind of caught me and reeled me in quick.
Yeah, so, over time, as you try to explain and find explanation for people what exactly you're building, these are the kind of things that you try and they kind of stick. But, I always find it interesting how people think I had this vision from the very beginning, not realizing that actually you have different visions and you smoke a lot of things before you get the stuff really right and people can relate to it and it becomes the common vocabulary. So there's no linear path from point A to point B.
I think this is an important question. I think for most of the fans, as far as the people who love your team on top of the language, when did and how did you guys get Brian involved?
Yes.
Yeah, so before Brian, there was Igor. And Igor is a guy I found on Twitter. It was kind of a love at first sight. We decided that he likes testing, I like testing. And then, oh my gosh, we're from the same country. How could you not like each other?
Yeah.
We all know about the Miško Igor bromance.
Yeah, we get it.
All right. I'm glad you get that one.
And so how'd you guys find Brian? Because he's pretty much, everyone has a man crush on him now, too. So how did you guys get Brian involved?
Brian, yes. So once we got Igor, and Igor kind of whipped it out into shape, and Igor is really the front facing, the community grower kind of a guy, and Brian was our first intern. And the goal we had for Brian was to build Batarang. And maybe Brian can speak more about it.
Yeah, sure. So I was just a college kid hunting for internships. And so I interviewed at Google just kind of generically, got past some technical interviews, and then eventually the time came to match me to a particular project. So I talked to a couple different teams, and I talked to Igor, and Igor was super intimidating on the phone. He was like, this is really important. We don't want you unless you're really excited about this. This is important. So I was like, this guy sounds like he's kind of scary, but I really want to do JavaScript stuff. So I went with the project and showed up at Google and found out that Igor is just this big lovable guy that's not actually scary at all. And so I worked on this extension Batarang that lets you kind of introspect Angular and see different things and debug things and get performance metrics. And that's how I got started with the project. When my internship was over, I kind of continued working part-time while I finished my degree, and then I graduated, and now I'm on the team full-time. So that's my life story as it pertains to Angular.
So, Brian, at what point did you start being known as the Joseph Gordon-Levitt of Angular?
Actually, I think that was just this morning. I think you coined that, actually.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to hearing that from more sources.
It's going on a podcast now, so.
Yeah, we need
official.
a meme for it.
Yeah.
I need to update my Twitter bio.
Yeah, you do.
Why in the heck did you call it battering?
That's a good question. So originally there were a couple different names that we had for it, but they were all around this kind of like Angular, Chrome, DevTools extension thing. And we thought like, oh, that's going to be kind of hard to Google, like Angular and Chrome, because you'll get like bug reports from GitHub about like some specific issue in a specific version of Chrome with a specific version of Angular and all of these sort of things. So we went with battering because if you search Angular and battering, like what else is there going to be? So I'm not sure if the name, by the way, for the those that aren't familiar, comes from like this boomerang like thing that Batman has, and Angular has this kind of superhero theme in our release names. So we thought this was like a fun, goofy thing to name it. So I don't know if I'm beating like the thing from Batman on Google search results quite yet, but but maybe soon.
Come on, community. Let's get some bots going. A mechanical Turk to get it up
No,
there.
you can't game Google searches. You can't do it.
That's true. That's funny.
So we're getting toward the end of our time. Is there anything else that we need to know about kind of the origin story of Angular?
I like what you did there, Chuck. We're talking about superheroes, and you talked about the origin story of Angular.
That's right.
I like that.
I get it.
Maybe the only other thing, because I get a lot of questions on this that I can't answer, would be what other software, other solutions kind of in the web world, I guess, inspired you or influenced you. I know in the past you've said Flex and kind of running away from the things that GWT or GWT was doing was also kind of a big deal. But were there any other things that you looked at that you think were influential?
I think Flex is the big one because I was actually working for Adobe on a product that Adobe was trying to release. It was going to be competition to Flex right before Adobe bought Micromedia, and with which it kind of got Flex. And of course, the project I was working on got canceled, which is actually how I got to Google, because I was a bit sad and decided to look for other opportunities. But Flex did actually influence a lot of the ideas, especially the ideas around data binding and things, and the declarative notion of like throwing a bunch of, in Flex it was XML that kind of looked like HTML, but this idea of just throwing declarative stuff on a page and actually instantiating components behind it.
That is interesting. I do meet a lot of Angular people who were like Flex developers in a past life, so that makes sense. Well, cool.
Hey, folks, I don't know if you've noticed, but I've been working a lot on figuring out how to help people become the most valuable developers on their teams, or becoming the top 5% of developers in the field. If you're looking to level up, figure out how to contribute more, get the career you want, get the career that you want that will support the lifestyle you want, then you should check out the Most Valuable Dev Summit. I've invited some of my friends across the community, people that you've heard of, people that have worked on systems that you use on a daily basis, people who have invented new ways of doing things over the years in programming, and I've asked them one question, and that question is, how do you become a top 5% developer? How do you become 1 in 20 of the best developers out there? And so we're going to go ahead and have that conversation with them in interviews on the Most Valuable Dev Summit, and you can find that at summit.mostvaluable.dev. All right, well, let's get to some picks. Aaron, do you want to start us with picks?
My first pick is Samsung's coming out with a new 105-inch TV, and you can pre-order it for $120,000. That sounded insane, but I'll put a link in the show notes so you can see it.
TV or a new Tesla? Let me think about that.
I know, right?
You should also include a link to your Kickstarter so people can donate towards you purchasing this television.
Yeah, I will. No, I will. So the other thing is Can I Use, which is a site I use a lot. Got a facelift. If anyone hasn't seen it recently, go check it out. I mean, the color scheme's the same, which makes you sad, but It looks nicer. It's cool. And then there's a program called JS Homes, which I'm going to include in the notes, but I'd like everyone to go check it out. It's by a dude named Eric Elliott, and he's trying to fight poverty with code, and this JS Homes Kickstarter will allow him to get equipment and facilities to train homeless people on how to code, and he's got some real-life practical examples of how he's helped people. So JS Homes is another thing that I'm going to pick this week. So those are my 3 picks.
Very cool. Brian, what are your picks?
My first pick is AngularJS itself. I figured.
Hey man, I was gonna pick that. That is so not fair.
Someone's gonna do it eventually. So
why don't you just go ahead and pick things like air and food?
Yeah, abstractions. Yes.
Abstractions.
Concepts. Okay. So my real pick is Angular Hint, which is a project that I'm making my interns work on this summer. And the idea is to instrument Angular to give you real-time feedback on certain best practices. So things like you're using this directive wrong, or you're manipulating the DOM from a controller, which you shouldn't do. And so it's still kind of work in progress, but hopefully by the time this podcast is actually released, you'll be able to use it.
I love that idea. That's awesome, man.
Yes, very nice. All right, Joe, what are your picks?
I'm only going to make one pick today. The new Weird Al album, Mandatory Fun, just came out. I've been listening to it on Spotify and really enjoying it. So maybe I'll do a second pick, which is Spotify. I upgraded to the premium Spotify, the $10 a month Spotify. And I never thought, that I would be paying for music, but I actually am paying for music in sort of a roundabout way. And I'm really appreciating that too. So I'm having a lot of fun listening to Weird Al's Mandatory Fun on my Spotify account.
Cool. I'm just going to pick a couple of Chrome plugins that I use that are pretty handy. One of them is Pretty JSON. If you are working on JSON APIs, which you probably are if you're using Angular, then if you just load up the endpoint with Pretty JSON instead of getting this awesome blob of text, it's just this wall of text. Pretty JSON actually parses it out and then shows you what's there. And in some cases, I'm actually passing back HTML within the JSON, and it actually renders that. So it'll render the header tags and all of that stuff too. So it's really nice. Really like that. Another one is Mod Header. And this was handy for me when I was trying to fake out an endpoint that I was writing that a specific agent would be using. In this case, it was for an RSS app, and I was trying to tell it that I was iTunes, and so it would, return RSS instead of HTML. And so by using the Mod Header plugin, I was actually able to fake it out so that it would say, hey, I'm iTunes, and you need to give me an RSS feed instead of the HTML representation. So I like both of those, and those are my picks. Miško, what are your picks?
Well, since Brian already took AngularJS, I'm going to go time travel. I'm going to pick the Internet Archive, and I'm going to ask you to go find getangular.com back in the history so you can see the site as it was originally.
Very nice.
Cool.
And finally, before we wrap up, do you have some tip or trick or favorite thing that you like to do with Angular?
Write tests.
Tip of the week, write tests.
But TDD is dead.
What?
Nice.
What about Brian? Tip of the week?
My tip of the week is before you file an issue on GitHub, search existing issues, including closed issues. See if someone else has also filed this. That's my tip. It's kind of self-serving.
Awesome. Aaron, do you have a tip of the week?
Yeah, don't go crazy on your NG classes. Keep them simple.
Joe?
My tip of the week is use good names for your injectable objects in Angular.
And
dude.
My tip of the week is, depending on what your backend is, I ran into an issue with CORS, which is the cross whatever something, because I was using a different subdomain.
Cross-origin restriction?
Yeah, so make sure that you understand that and have the right headers on your backend if you're going cross-domain.
Cool. All right.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.